Okay, so again, we were looking yesterday at Perek Yud, and I want to juxtapose for a moment Perek Yud and Perek Yud Aleph, because both of them talk about military campaigns, and both involve multiple kings. So for Perek Yud, you'll remember the Maaseh was that there were 5 kings, including Adoni Tzedek, the Melech Yerushalayim, that declared war against Givon, because the Givonim made peace with Bnei Yisrael, and they thought that would endanger the Canaanite position. And the Givonim then turned to Yehoshua for aid, and Yehoshua gathered his army against those 5 kings. The armies were defeated, the armies were annihilated, and the 5 kings were executed and hung. And the 2 significant aspects of that story is, number one, as the armies of those kings were retreating before they were massacred and defeated, there were hailstones, huge hailstones that came down min hashamayim, and the pasuk says the people that died from the hail was even greater than the casualties of the war. And the second part of the story is, of course, the very famous stopping of the sun for either 6 hours or 12 hours or 24 hours. Some even say more than that. Different opinions, the great miracle, and we left off with the statement that this has never happened. There was never a situation where God listened to the voice of a man ordering the sun to stop. And yesterday we discussed the fact that, well, this is not the first time that the sun stopped, and it's not the last time the sun stopped. The sun stopped for Moshe. The sun stopped for Yaakov Avinu. The sun stopped for Chizkiyahu when he was sick, and the sun stopped much later for Nakdimon ben Gurion in order that he should be able to meet his commitment to pay back the water that he had borrowed. But the Meforshim say that in all of the other cases, the sun stopped. Hashem, in the merit of the tzaddik, Hashem gave a great miracle, but it was not at the order of a person. A person didn't order the sun to stop. Here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mamish listened to Yehoshua that said, Shemesh ba'givain dam, let the sun in Givon stop. Now, when it describes that miracle, there's another phrase that's used. Halo kisuva b'sefer hayoshor. Behold, this is written in the book of the upright. Meaning, if you want to know about this miracle, behold, it is written in the Sefer Yehoshua. That's very enigmatic. What is the Sefer Yehoshua? What is Sefer Yehoshua? So there are many different opinions about this. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that Sefer Yehoshua is actually a remez to either the Torah as a whole, or in particular Sefer Bereishis or Chumash Bereishis. That Chumash Bereishis is called Sefer Yehoshua because it is the story of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov that are called Yesharim. They are called the upright ones. So essentially, Sefer Yehoshua is Chumash Bereishis. So Derech Agav, the Netziv, in his Hakdama to Hamikdavar's Hakdama to Sefer Bereishis, actually goes into this idea. Why is Sefer Bereishis called Sefer Yehoshua? Because he explains that the idea of Yoshor is not so much Bein Adam Lamakom, it is primarily Bein Adam Lechavero. In the book of Bereishis, there are relatively few obligations of Bein Adam Lamakam. I mean, the mitzvahs were not really given yet. Yeah, the Avos may have kept the whole Torah before it was given, but in terms of mitzvahs, how many mitzvahs do you have in Chumash Bereishis? You actually have 3 mitzvahs that out of the 613. We have the mitzvah of Pru Urvu, being fruitful and multiplying, the mitzvah of procreation. We have the mitzvah of Bris Milah, circumcision, which was given to Avram, and we have the mitzvah in this week's Parsha, the negative commandment of not eating the sciatic nerve, not eating the what's called the Gid HaNasheh, to commemorate the idea of Yaakov struggling with the angel and the angel smiting him on the thigh. So Sefer Chumash Bereishis is not a book about mitzvos that Hashem commands you. There's no reference to Shabbos, to Kashrus, to Tefillin. All of these things came later, even if the Avos may have kept them, but that's not recorded, meaning the Chumash does not talk about that. But he says the primary thing you take from Chumash Bereshis is about midos, about tzedakah, about chesed, and the like, and that is the idea of yashrus. Yesharim lamakim is Sefer HaYashar. Okay, so whatever the reason, if Sefer HaYashar means Chumash Bereshis, so what does the pasuk mean? Yehoshua ordered the sun to stop. And behold, this is alluded to in Sefer HaYashar Chumash Bereshis. Well, where is it alluded to in Chumash Bereshis that Yehoshua is going to stop the sun? So Rashi, on that pasuk, actually says it is alluded to in Parshas Vayechi, the last parsha in Chumash Bereshis. Remember that Yaakov is on his deathbed, and Yaakov cannot see very well, and he asks for Yosef to bring his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to him, and then you'll remember the story that Yosef puts Manasseh, the older son, to Yaakov's right, because the older son is supposed to get the better bracha. Although it's interesting that Yaakov should, Yaakov knows that that's not always the case, but whatever it is. So Manasseh is placed to Yaakov's right, and Ephraim is placed to Yaakov's left, and Yaakov switched his hands, so his left hand would be on Manasseh, and his right hand would be on Ephraim, that Ephraim would be more dominant than Manasseh. Ephraim was more righteous, whatever it would be, and Yehoshua ben Nun comes from Shevet Ephraim. And when Yosef asked him, why don't you put your right on the older son? So he says, Manasseh will have Hatzlacha, but with Ephraim, Zaro Yiyah, this is in Vayechi, Zaro Yiyah Malo Goyim. His seed will do something that will fill the nations of the world with envy. So Rashi understands that is an indirect allusion, that the seed of Ephraim, the descendant of Ephraim, Yehoshua, will do something that will amaze the whole world. And that's what it means in your Sefer Yehoshua. Behold, this is alluded to in the Sefer HaYashar, which is Chumash Bereshis. Rashi learns the pasuk Zarei, which is going on Ephraim, Yiyeh Maloi Goyim, he shall fill the nations with admiration and amazement. Because when the sun stopped, apparently it was a worldwide phenomenon. Now, obviously, you have to figure this out. Maybe we need an astronomer, because half of the world is dark. So I assume when it was dark, but at least every part of the world that had daylight, the day was prolonged. So everybody saw this great, great miracle. And that's Zaro Yiyah Maloi Goyim. There is another pshat, which I don't think has a makar in Chazal, but some say that maybe it is alluded to in Yosef's dream. So it's not Ephraim specific, meaning Rashi's makor is Ephraim specific. The second makor I'm going to tell you is not Ephraim specific, but it's Yosef. And Ephraim, of course, comes from Yosef. And that is when Yosef's dreams in next week's parsha. So Yosef had a dream that the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to him. Now, although Chazal interpret the sun is Yaakov and the moon is Yosef's mother, although not Rachel, because Rachel died, but Bilhah, who eventually bowed down, and the 11 stars are the tribes. But perhaps the bowing down of the sun, at least, this doesn't explain everything else, is a remez that a descendant of Yosef shall have power over the sun, ordering the sun to stop moving. So we have two pshatim, meaning Sefer HaYashar means Bereshis, and there are two possible allusions to the stopping of the sun by either Yosef and his descendants of Yosef or Ephraim specifically. One is Yaakov Avinu's statement, V'zaro Yiyeh Malo Goyim, or Yosef's dream that the sun will bow down to him i.e., the son will be subordinated, S-U-N, the son will be subordinated to the Zerah of Yosef, which is Ephraim. Okay, so that's just the reference to Sefer Yehoshua. Okay, now, so chapter 10, Perek Yud, is essentially a southern war, meaning all of the kings that were enumerated are in the south of Eretz Israel. Remember, the two cities that we can identify is the king of Yerushalayim, Adoni-Tzedek, and the king of Hebron. So this is typically called the southern campaign. This got us the southern portion of Eretz Israel, which we will see later was largely occupied by Shevet Yehuda. But we'll get to the division a little later on. Perek Yud Aleph discusses a second campaign against the Jewish people, led by kings of the north, and in particular, the lead king here was the Melech of Chatzor. Chatzor was a major city in the north, and they had heard what had happened in the south, and they got together, and they waged war against the Jewish people, and a war took place near a lake that is called Mei Marom. Mei Marom, which literally means high waters. What is Mei Maron? Well, Mei Maron is extinct. Mei Maron is gone. If you think about the waterways, right, we have the Yarden River, which there are other rivers in Eretz Israel, but the Yarden is the main river. That's Israel's version of the Mississippi River, so to speak, although it's a lot smaller. And if you go, the Yarden ends in the Dead Sea, right? The Yarden flows into the Yam HaMelech. But if you go north along the Yarden, you will see that the Yarden flows from Yam Kinneret, although the truth is the streams of the Yarden are much north of Yam Kinneret. It flows into the Kinneret, and then it keeps on going past the Kinneret until it reaches the Dead Sea. Now, if you look at old maps of Israel, by an old map, I don't mean an ancient map. If you look at a map of Israel in 1948, or 1950, or 1960, you will actually see that north of Kinneret, north of Yam Kinneret, was a small other lake, another lake north of Kinneret, that used to go by the name Chula. And Chula, what's called Chula, was in fact Mei Marom. It's called Marom because it's higher. It's higher than Kinneret. It's going north, so to speak. And the reason why, right, so tell your guide you want to visit Lake Chula. He will look at you as if you're nuts, because Lake Chula is no longer there, because basically it became a very mosquito-infested area, became marshy. It was a very small lake to begin with, and the Israeli government simply drained it. So there is no Lake Chula anymore. But I know people who remember Lake Chula. They used to go there for different recreational activities. This goes back into the 40s, the 50s, and the like. And Lake Chula is alluded to in the book of Yehoshua. This was the war of the kings of the north, Mei Marom. And once again, it describes Yehoshua as defeating them. Lo sechaye kol neshama. No person was allowed to live. They did not accept shalom and the like. Now here, though, although obviously it was a great military victory, al pi Hashem, there is no supernatural miracle that is recorded, meaning unlike what's called the Southern Campaign, where you had both the hailstones and the stopping of the sun, there is no nes nigla that is recorded in what is called the Northern Campaign. But there are some unusual things that happened in that war up north that I don't really have a great mahalach for, and the Meforshim don't help you very much. First of all, interestingly enough, they were commanded that since the king of Chatzor was the leader, they were commanded to not only kill the people, but Chatzor as a city was to be totally burnt down. And as far as I know, this was the only city in the kibush of Eretz Yisrael that the physical buildings, well, Yericho, Yericho was that way too, but Yericho had a special miracle. The walls collapsed. Now, it doesn't say, it's interesting, it does not say that you had to destroy the buildings of Yericho. Although it does say anyone who rebuilds the walls will die. So we discussed this. It's possible that even Yericho, you were allowed to live in Yericho. If you didn't rebuild the walls, you can live in Yericho. So I'm going to look at the language again. But as far as I know, Chatzor is the only city in which not only were the inhabitants killed, but the actual physical city had to be destroyed and burnt. I don't know why, meaning to say, okay, the king of Chatzor was a bad guy who, organized kings to go against the Jewish people, but, frankly, all of the Canaanites were bad guys, so it's hard to know, right? That's why with Syria, right, the Syrian government collapsed. Well, are we happy or not? Baruch Hashem, that Assad is gone. Okay, so who's replacing him? They may be worse. You don't know. So it's not like, the Russia is replaced by the tzaddik. In fact, somebody was talking to me. It was interesting about the notion how it's not just the Israeli army, but like all armies find ways to romanticize the mission so that people very much want to join an army. Like, he gave me an example, and this actually was a soldier in the army. This is actually someone who was actually in the army. He gave me an example of Russia versus Ukraine. Like, why would somebody, let's say you're Ukrainian, why would you give your life to prevent Russia from taking over? Your life is lousy under the Ukrainian government, and it'll probably be lousy under the Russian government. So Lamai Nafkamina, well, what is it that say, I'm going to give my life so I can continue to be ruled by tyrants in Ukraine, and I'm not going to let the tyrants in Russia. Lamai Nafkamina, meaning the whole idea is kind of a very, very strange idea that, you're loyal to these causes that have no impact on your actual life. Okay, but be it as it may, so one thing to know, so I'm just pointing a ha'ara, I'm not giving you an answer. The unique idea that Chatzor is physically destroyed. As a city, none of the other cities were. The second thing that's unusual about the northern campaign is that all of the chariots of the enemy, whether from Chatzor or from the other kings, the chariots, they came with a lot of chariots, have to also be burnt, destroyed. Now, Shalal, it's not like Yericho. The spoils of war, the gold, the silver, the clothing, that could be taken, even from Chatzor. Okay, so it's not the same as Yericho. The spoils of war were permitted to be taken, but the city of Chatzor had to be destroyed, and all chariots had to be destroyed as well. I'll give you a little explanation for that in a minute. So there's the destruction of Chatzor, there's the destruction of the chariots, and then there's the third thing, which is the most problematical of all of the horses that are taken from these northern armies, whether Chatzor or the other kings, have to be hamstrung. You know what hamstringing a horse is? You cut the tendon, the major tendons in the back of the leg. A hamstrung horse fundamentally can obviously not run, but it also cannot really walk very well. It limps. Basically, you're mutilating the horses. Now, again, this is absolutely unique. This did not occur. There's something about this northern campaign that has some special rules that don't apply anywhere else. And of all of the things, the hamstringing the horses seemed to be the biggest problem, because we know there's an Isser D'Oraisa of tsar balei chayim, of causing pain to animals. So some Meforshim want to say, well, hamstringing a horse doesn't really cause pain to an animal. But, listen, I mean, Mitzias is Mitzias. I mean, say, oh, it doesn't bother the horse. Well, it does bother the horse. Horses are made to run, to gallop. The thing is a cripple. You're making the horse a cripple. There's no question that this is a pu'ula of Tsar Balei Chayim. Now, halachically, if Hashem says to do it, so you do it. So it's not a question of how could they do it, but the question more is, why would Hashem command it if it causes Tsar Balei Chayim? So here, the Malbim says, I mean, they give answers, but I don't know, I mean, it's not for me to judge. The answers are not mishnachneya, meaning they don't really persuade so much. But I'll tell you what the answer that the Meforshim give. We see later in the Torah, well, not later, earlier in the Torah, right, in Parsha Shoftim, the Torah talks about a melech is not allowed to accumulate a lot of horses, lest he return the people to Mitzrayim. So here we have a little bit of a similar idea. We don't want the Jewish people to accumulate a lot of horses and a lot of chariots. This is the same thing, because then they might be led astray into thinking that their later victories are because of their military might, because of their armaments. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants the Jewish people to kind of be under-weaponized, underfunded, so they will always have the hakara that the nitzachon comes from Hashem. So if they would keep the chariots and not hamstring the horses, they might attribute subsequent nitzachon to kochi v'yotzem yadi, which the Torah itself identifies as an occupational hazard. Therefore, the horses are hamstrung and the chariots are burnt. Now, I'm assuming, although I don't have a raya, that if you're told you have to hamstring the horses, you do have the option of just killing the horses outright, which might be better. Meaning, if you want to keep the horses, this is what you have to do. But I don't think you have to keep the horses in that condition. You could kill them, either before you take them or hamstring them or afterwards. That way you take them out of their misery, whatever it is. Well, this is the reason Meforshim give, but number one, it only applied here. We had other wars where there was no such restriction, unless you're going to say in the other wars there weren't chariots and horses. I mean, you're still picking a particular war and you're giving us these special rules. So I'm just going to leave that as a tzorach, something to think about. So again, when you compare Perek Yud and Perek Yud Aleph, Perek Yud is the war of the southern kings, including Yerushalayim and Hebron, and that was distinguished by the hailstones and the stopping of the sun. Perek Yud Aleph is the war at Mei Marom, Chula, north of the Kinneret, and here we don't have miracles, but it was a great military victory, and we have the unusual rules of burning the city of Chatzor, destroying all chariots, and hamstringing the horses. And again, those were unique only for those particular wars. Now, a final point about the northern campaign is the word north is actually a misnomer. Because it's only called north because that's as far north as Yehoshua got. In modern Israel, we would actually call that Merkaz, or maybe the southern part of the Galil. There are areas far north of that, going into Lebanon, which in fact were not even captured in Yehoshua's lifetime and were captured later. So when it says north, don't think of this as the northern boundary of Eretz Yisrael. It simply means it's as far north as Yehoshua got, which basically means that the conquests of Yehoshua take you somewhat north of Yam Kinneret, right? Somewhat north of Tiberia, what used to be Lake Chula. Mei Marom was the as far as Yeshua got, but the northern boundary of Eretz Yisrael is much further. Even the state of Israel is further than that, and of course, Eretz Yisrael goes beyond the northern boundary of Medinat Yisrael, going into Lebanon, and the like. Okay. Again, we'll discuss what happened to those other territories. Now, you'll remember I did mention, getting ahead of myself, that when the land is divided among the tribes, even the unconquered land is divided. So Asher, for example, is far north. Asher is given territory that was not even conquered in Yoshua's lifetime, but it was assigned to him. Right? So don't confuse the extent of Yoshua's conquests to the extent of the land that is going to be divided among the tribes, which includes areas that Yoshua did not conquer yet. Okay. Now, we then move to Perek Yud Beis. So it's Yud Aleph, Yud Beis. And Yud Beis is essentially a summary by the end of Yoshua's life, because Yoshua is towards the end of his life, actually. The last 7 years of his life, because he dies shortly after the division of the land is completed. And it's a summary of Yoshua's, or not just Yoshua's conquest, but the land that the Jewish people have conquered up to this point. And it starts with a reiteration of what Moshe Rabbeinu had already conquered. So you'll remember that Moshe Rabbeinu, this is in the 40th year of the Midbar, had conquered land east of the Yarden, and the two kings whose land had been conquered is Sichon, Melech Amori, Sichon, the king of the Amori, and Og, the king of Bashan. And the land of Sichon and Og were conquered by Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar before Moshe Rabbeinu died, and that land was given to the tribes of Ruvain and Gad and Chatzi. Chatzi doesn't mean half, by the way, but it means a portion. Certain families in the tribe of Menashe had their land east of the Yarden. Okay, so essentially, Perek Yud Beis gives us some of the boundaries. So again, the geography of Sefer Yehoshua is actually a very, very important part of the Sefer, but it's a part that we don't always know exactly because we don't know where all of those places are. But I just want to go over very, very briefly just a few landmarks, so you'll have a generic sense. And maybe actually, if you take an art school Nach, you can see different maps, which once again are subject to machloksim anyway. Maybe I'll get a map duplicated or whatever. Again, you have to envision the Yarden River that flows. It starts north of Yam Kinneret. It flows through Mei Marom, then into the Kinneret, then past the Kinneret, and it flows all the way to the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea itself has a number of rivers or streams that flow into it. I mean, the Yarden flows into it from the north, but there's another major river that flows into the Dead Sea that is called Nachal. Nachal means a stream or a river, Arnon. So if you could picture a map in your head, so you have the Dead Sea, and right in the middle of the Dead Sea, meaning going from north to south, in the middle of the Dead Sea, coming from Jordan, you have a big river that's called Nachal Arnon. Nachal Arnon is the southern boundary on the east of the Jordan of Sichon Melech HaAmori. Meaning south of Arnon was not the Malchus of Sichon. South of Arnon was not conquered by Bnei Yisrael. So let me give you some background here. The Gemara explains that originally the land east of the Yarden was the possession of the nations of Ammon and Moab. Now, Ammon and Moab are the descendants of Lot and his daughters. Remember, after Sodom was destroyed, so Lot got drunk, And the daughters, one daughter had relations with him when her father was drunk and got pregnant, and she named the child from that relationship Moab, which means from my father. Not too modest there. The second night, Lot again got drunk, had relations with the second daughter, and she said, Ammon, my nation, my people, a little more reticent. These became the nations of Ammon and Moab. And where did they live? Now, Lot originally lived in Stone, but eventually they lived east of the Ardain. East of the Ardain was originally the territory of Ammon and Moab. By the way, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes a Maisa. This is in the Hakdama of one of the Igros Moshes, that there was a man in Russia who was, when Russia was in Russia, who spoke very disparagingly about the daughters of Lot, kind of saying that, what type of prutzos are these women that they go ahead and they have incest with their father. And that night, he had a dream. Rav Moshe would tell the story. Rav Moshe was not like a Maisa teller, in which these radiant women who looked like angels, shining with holiness, came to him in a dream. And they told him, we're Lot's daughters. And you don't realize that we acted totally for the sake of heaven. Because in the aftermath of Sodom, we thought the whole world was destroyed. So we have to do what we have to do to perpetuate humanity. And you will be punished very much because you disparage our righteousness. And the man suffered a horrible death, something like he kind of choked on his tongue. His tongue went. Like this is a problem with epileptic seizures sometimes. The tongue goes back and whatever, the person died a very, very horrible death. And Rav Moshe used to tell the story that one has to be zahir in the kavod of even Lot's daughters. But be it as it may, the original occupiers, I mean, there was a nation before them, but in the time of the Torah, the original occupiers of Ever HaYarden were Ammon and Moab. Now, the Torah commanded Bnei Yisrael that we are not allowed to wage war with Ammon and Moab because God gave them this land, and therefore we're not allowed to take it away from them. But we were not allowed to wage war against Ammon and Moab, but Sichon Melech HaEmori conquered Moabite territory from Nachal Arnon, going north, till another river, Nachal Yabok, that flows into the Jordan. Nachal Arnon flows into the Dead Sea. Nachal Yabok flows into the Jordan. The land of that Sichon conquered from Moab is from Arnon to Yabok. South of Arnon was still the land of Moab. From Arnon to Yabok is the land of Sichon. Now, the Gemara in Gittin explains, once Sichon took the land from Moab, we were then permitted to take the land from Sichon, because we're no longer taking Moabite territory, we're taking Emorite, one of the 7 nations, although it's not Eretz Yisrael. The Kedusha, in terms of Truma, Meiser, and Shemitah of Ever Yarden, is a huge, huge machlokas. I mean, do you have to take Trumas and Masras in Ever Yarden? It's a very, very big discussion. But L'chol HaPachas, we were given permission and authorization to conquer it. Okay, so the land of Sichon is from Arnon to Yabok. By the way, Nachal Yabok is very, very important. It is actually mentioned in this week's Parsha, when Yaakov is coming from Haran, which is Syria, and he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, he crosses Nachal Yabok, and he's going to enter the land south of Nachal Yabok, and then you'll recall, he forgot some small jars, and he went back himself to cross he crossed north, right? He crossed the river north, and that is where he encounters the mysterious man that is the angel of Esav. Okay, so I don't expect you to be experts in geography. I am not an expert in geography. But just to know some of the landmarks, Nachal Arnon, Nachal Yabok. South of Arnon is the land of, it's still the land of Moab, so we're not allowed to conquer it. But Sichon had conquered from Arnon to Yabok, but only a certain amount going east, meaning to say, far further east is the land of Ammon. So Sichon was able to conquer the Moabite land. He couldn't conquer the Ammonite land. So the way it works is, south of Arnon is Moab. North of Arnon until Yabok is Eretz Sichon. But as you go further east, there's an Ammonite border. So Sichon could not conquer the Ammonites, and we were not allowed to conquer the Ammonite territory because we could only take what was conquered by Sichon. Now, north of Yabok was also conquered, but that was the land of a different king, Og Melech Habashan. Okay, so from Arnon to Yabok is Eretz Sichon, although to the east of that would be Ammon. North of Yabok begins the land of Og Melech Habashan, and we were allowed to conquer that as well. And in terms of Reuven and Gad, the basic idea was Reuven and Gad divided the land of Sichon, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe got the land of Og. That's more or less approximately the way that division worked. So before the Perek Yud Beis discusses Yehoshua's conquest, it goes over the conquest of Moshe Rabbeinu, and it gives you the boundaries of Eretz Sichon, Og, and the territory that still belonged to Moab and Ammon that we were not allowed to touch until Mashiach comes. After that, it then enumerates the kings that Yehoshua had vanquished in his 7 years of conquest, and it mentions 31 kings. You probably have heard this. Chazal constantly say Yehoshua was able to vanquish Lamed Aleph Malachim, 31 kings. However, even that is a little misleading, because vanquishing the king doesn't always mean conquering the territory. The one outstanding example is when it mentions the 31 kings that Yehoshua vanquished, it mentions Adoni Tzedek, Melech Yerushalayim, but as I explained yesterday, even though the king of Yerushalayim was killed, we actually did not conquer Yerushalayim. Now, most of the other ones we actually conquered. But you see, Yerushalayim, we actually did not conquer. Now, I'm going to leave it for next week. There is, after that list, a very, very perplexing pasuk, a very difficult idea. It makes the point, there was not a single city except the Givonim that made peace with Bnei Yisrael, that accepted Shalom. Okay, that's true, and that's why they were annihilated. But then it says, and this came from Hashem, in order that Bnei Yisrael should be able to destroy these nations, and they shouldn't be a michshol to Klal Yisrael. So what you seem to be having here is the old problem of Hashem hardening Paro's heart, meaning the implication of the pasuk is, sure, if the Jewish people are achieving victory after victory after victory, and every victory they wipe out a city, one might assume that the Givonim shouldn't be the only one who want to make Shalom. So why didn't other cities make Shalom? Again, this is only a kasha like the Rambam, that they have the option of making Shalom. And it says, Hashem hardened their hearts so that we would destroy them. That's what the pasuk says. So this is something we need to talk about and think about, and that is, well, gee, is that fair? If the mashmos is, they would have made Shalom had they been able to act on the basis of their desire. Is it fair that Hashem is taking away, so to speak, their free will? Is hardening their heart so that they will get killed? Because that's the alternative. It's a pretty drastic alternative, right? If you don't make shalom, if you're of the 7 nations, you die. And Hashem wanted them to die. Therefore, Hashem took away their free will to make shalom. So that we're going to have to talk about. And again, it'll be very much connected to Hashem hardening Paro's heart and getting punished for it. Same problem. Is that going to be just? Is that fair? Okay, so we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.